¿verdad? Next slides. Para comenzar, mi nombre es Amira, soy de Puerto Rico y hoy me acompaña Katrina de Trinidad y nuestra presentadora Afifa de Guyana. Next. Y antes de comenzar, nos gustaría escuchar de ustedes. Pueden tanto escribirlo en el chat como prender el micrófono y decir a voz alta qué significa la organización inclusiva para ti.
Would anyone like to share? Feel free to open your mic and let us know what does inclusive organizing mean to you, or you can type in the chat as well. Okay, I guess we have a shy audience again tonight. Do I see a hand? Feel free to open your mic. I'm actually not able to see the name of the person. Oh, Rick.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Inclusive organizing means that nobody gets left behind. You include everybody, male, female, small, big, large, medium. Nobody gets left behind. That is what inclusive organizing means for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. Would anyone else like to share? Okay, I can just jump right into it then. So, right, so inclusive organizing. And thank you so much, Rick, for sharing your view of what inclusive organizing means. And you are actually absolutely correct. So if we are to attempt to kind of define inclusive organizing, we can say that inclusive organizing involves inviting and ensuring access, a safe and welcoming environment, partnership opportunities, and leadership for people of all backgrounds, communities, and identities. And this might relate to a person's race, their ethnicity, their nationality, language, religious identity, immigration status. It could relate to sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, ability, and that includes physical ability, health, including mental health, socioeconomic status, and how these and other facets of identity interact. And I know I just call out a really long list, but as people, we have so many different diverse characteristics that make up our identities. And as one individual, you can identify with multiple identities. For example, I identify as a mixed Guyanese woman, and that's just 3 of my many characteristics. That's just my race, my nationality, my gender. There's so many more characteristics or identities that I identify with. And it's really important to recognize how diverse our identities are because our identities influence our experiences. Our identities influence our access to resources, the way we experience impacts, what solutions may help us, what solutions might not. And specifically when it comes to climate or adaptation organizing, we know that the climate crisis affects everyone, but how persons experience those impacts is different. When a disaster strikes, for example, A man might experience those impacts differently than how a woman might experience those impacts, because women have different health and sanitary needs than men. How a child is affected is different. How someone from a low income household is affected is different from someone from, say, a wealthy family who has access to financial resources to build back their homes. So it's when we're organizing against the climate crisis, it is very important to have persons from all these varying backgrounds and identities represented in the discussions. It is important to have persons from all these backgrounds and identities at the table, contributing to decisions, providing solutions, sharing their experiences, and receiving equal benefits. That's basically what inclusive organizing is about. And as Rick said, ensuring that no one gets left behind. So to simplify inclusive organizing a bit, or to break it down a bit further, we can think of it in terms of three big concepts. And these are diversity, inclusion, and equity. So starting with diversity, when we speak about diversity, we refer to the existence of differences within a group of people. So that includes all the different backgrounds and identities I mentioned before. So if you, for example, say you have a group of 4 persons and they're each person is able to represent a different community. Say, for example, you have a mix of men and women, you have a mix of different races, you have persons from different economic backgrounds. Just having that difference within your group is really just the meaning of diversity. Like once you have people that represent different communities, like yes, yeah, you have a diverse group. When we speak about inclusion, the second concept, this is the ability of different people to raise their perspectives authentically in a diverse group. So for example, if we look at gender and say we have a group that is made up of like 30% men, 30% women, and 30% non-binary persons, as far as percentages go, you can say that you've possibly achieved perfect gender balance. But if the men in the group do not allow the women or persons who identify as non-binary to share their perspectives or to make decisions, then the group is not inclusive. You can have a very diverse group, as in the example we have a fair gender balance, but if you don't allow everyone to equally contribute, then it's not inclusive organizing. And the third concept is equity. And this is the fair distribution of power and benefits. So coming back to our example with gender, with the group of men, women, and non-binary persons, if the men in that group do not allow the women and non-binary persons to have leadership roles or to benefit from, say, for example, capacity building opportunities, then it's not equity. If one person or one community of people have all the power in a group or they receive all the benefits, then again, it's not inclusive organizing. So really, when we think of inclusive organizing and these three big concepts, they go hand in hand with each other: diversity, inclusion, and equity. And having diversity alone is not enough. Many times in organizing persons, they easily want to check that box for diversity. Like, yes, there's an Indigenous person. Yes, there's someone from the LGBTQI plus community. Yes, there's someone living with disability, or there's sufficient numbers of women, but they don't allow those persons to contribute to discussions or share power or benefits. So if you just have diversity in a group and you don't have inclusion, equity, you might actually cause more harm to the individuals involved, because then you're inviting persons to the space and then you're isolating them in that space. So it's really, really important when you think of inclusive organizing to ensure that you have all three concepts covered. And when we speak of inclusive organizing, think of it in terms of within your teams and also outside of your teams. So if you're creating a team, if you're putting together a team of volunteers to lead an initiative, try to ensure that you have diversity within that team. Try to ensure that you include everyone's voices, you listen to their opinions, you give them their perspectives value within that team, and ensure that there's equity in that team and that there's fair distribution of power, there's fair distribution of benefits, and the team is just working cohesively. And aside from that team, when you also plan activities or events and you try to engage the wider public, also practice inclusive organizing in that sense. So when you're planning your activities or you're building out your movement, engaging the wider public, think of the wider community, the persons or stakeholders on the ground. Ensure there's diversity among those persons that you engage. When you engage them, ensure that you give them due credit and inclusion and allow them to share their point of views, and ensure that when you engage different communities on the ground, there's a dynamic where you share power with decision making, share power with leadership roles, everyone benefits. So just coming back again, diversity, inclusion, equity, the core of inclusive organizing. So just to touch a bit on the importance of inclusive organizing, Uh, inclusive organizing, it's important because it challenges efforts to silence the voices of people who have been marginalized or excluded. So organizing as a whole, when you think about it, it should be inclusive. However, we know that that's not always been the case over the years with the history of the climate movement and with any social issue as a whole. There usually is some bias or discrimination that causes groups of persons to be systemically marginalized and excluded from spaces. And so because organizing has not been inclusive over the years, we now have the concept of inclusive organizing, where we actively try to change this, where we're actively challenging efforts to silence the voices of those people that have been continuously excluded from spaces. Inclusive organizing builds solidarity among our communities when we work together, when we learn from each other, and when we support each other. Inclusive organizing, it's also a rejection of the idea that any of us deserve to remain vulnerable or to be left out of the conversation. None of us deserve to be left out of the conversation. And inclusive organizing directly challenges that age-old concept. Inclusive organizing also helps to increase creativity. When we have different persons from different backgrounds and identities, they bring different perspectives to the table. They allow us to create amazing and innovative ideas together. Inclusive organizing increases productivity when we're able to utilize partnerships across different groups to share the burden of the tasks between those different groups. So instead of trying to do everything in your own space, there are so many other groups out there that are also acting for the same change. So inclusive organizing is also including those different groups, creating partnerships across those different groups, sharing the work and working together for a common output or a common outcome. So when we work together through these partnerships, we get to share resources, we get to share capacity, and overall, our impact is greater. Inclusive organizing also allows us to be more connected to communities. When we work with persons on the ground in communities, we're able to better understand the issues that they face. We're able to find better solutions that work for everyone. And it allows us to focus on environmental and climate justice. So by including the voices of groups that are usually marginalized, we ensure that persons most affected by climate impacts are part of the conversation and they benefit equally from the solutions. They help to craft the solutions together. And so we come to a place where we have more climate justice and not just one-off solutions that benefit one group versus another. So I know I got a lot there, and I just want to pause a bit to maybe take a deep breath and process everything that I've just said. And to kind of ground us back in the moment, I wanted to share this quote from Arundhati Roy, which I think really speaks to the concept behind inclusive organizing. And it says, "There's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard." And I'll read it again. "There's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard." And I think that's a very powerful quote. And just taking a moment, I wanted to encourage you all to think about this in your organizing work. Like, what kind of space would you want to create when you're organizing? Is it one where persons are silenced or one where everyone is heard? So when you're creating your movements, creating your groups, building your campaigns, hosting your activities, if you could just remember that there's no such thing as voiceless and try to give space for everyone to be included, that would be really great. And just to kind of shift the format of our session a bit, I want to change it more to a bit of a conversation. Maybe we can chat about a few things. I do have a couple questions that I want us to think about together. I want to hear some thoughts from you as it relates to inclusive organizing. And so you can let me know. You can either open your mic or you could type in the chat, whichever you prefer. But the first question I wanted us to look at or to think about is how can we fully incorporate a diversity of communities and people? So when we're organizing, how can we ensure that we involve people from various different backgrounds, identities, and communities? So feel free to open your mic or type in the chat your thoughts on this. Hi, Christine, I see your hand is raised. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Afifa. Thank you for that overview of inclusivity and diversity and equity. I really appreciate it. And I think to answer the question, how can we fully incorporate the diversity of community? I think community work and campaigns, it takes a lot of work, and it doesn't only mean like meeting people in a room somewhere at like 6 p.m. on some evening. I think if we want to be inclusive, we really have to go to people and meet them where they are, because sometimes when we have our little agenda or our meeting set up, it might not work for people that benefits or who would produce the best solutions to the issue. So a lot of times you kind of have to think outside of the box. So for example, women, if you want to involve them, you might have to go at their house at maybe at a time that works for them, because they work, or maybe they're at home but they have to take care of their kids. So the time when you have meetings, those are all things you have to take into consideration, and just being mindful of the community and understanding community dynamics, because when we want to do community work, we have to understand what the community needs, not what organizer or organization, what they may think a community need, but actually understand what the people living in those places, what they need, and they can actually come up with their own solutions if they're given the tools.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. I completely agree with that. Definitely with meeting people where they are. Sometimes we do have like different access to different resources and different spaces. Sometimes you definitely need to take the space to people who are not able to come to your space. Would anyone else like to share in terms of how we can fully incorporate different communities and different people when we're organizing? Right. So when we're at the beginning of like organizing a campaign or organizing an event, it's important for us to think about who we're inviting to that event or who needs to be in that conversation. So one of the things that we can do is conduct like a stakeholder analysis to sort of ensure that we include representatives from the different diverse communities. And when I say stakeholder analysis, I don't mean anything overly complex, but at the very least, thinking about what your activity is, the space that you're working in, the community that you're working in, and who are the people in that space, in that community that need to be involved in your activity. So making a list of all the different organizations and all the different groups of people that should be represented or have a say in relation to the issues that you're addressing. It's really important to kind of list it out, ensure that you don't miss anyone because everyone is important and everyone deserves a space in the conversation. And once you've sort of decided who you need to involve, you can think about where and when, where and how, like where you're going to have your activity and how you're going to have that activity. So as Christine mentioned, sometimes you need to take the activity to persons if you know persons that you really need to have involved in the conversation cannot come to the space that might be easiest for you to provide. So when you're thinking about how you're going to have that activity, ensure that it caters for the different needs of the different communities that you've invited or that you've identified that need to be part of that space. So for example, if it's an in-person event, ensure that's in a common space in the community, a space that's easily accessible, a space that you can access by public transportation so that you don't make it difficult for persons to actually reach to your venue. If you know you have persons with disabilities that will be at your event, then ensure that your venue is accessible to, for example, persons with wheelchairs. It's on the lower flat. There's ramp access into the compound or into the building. Ensure that you cater for all those things. And similarly, if you're hosting a virtual space, ensure that it's a space that also caters for the different needs of different persons. So the second question I wanted to throw out at you all is, what are some examples of communities of people commonly left out of the conversation? So I know like some of them were mentioned earlier when I was speaking. I know Christine also mentioned like women. So if you would like to just drop in the chat, what are like common communities that you know have always been marginalized or tend to be left out of the conversation? The reason for this is that sometimes it's always good to have like a reference list, ensure that you do not forget anyone when you're planning. Because when you're in the middle of planning a project or planning an event, your things are all over the place. It's hectic, and you might not remember that, okay, you need to target a specific group of persons, or there's an organization that you need to include there, a group that is affected by the issue you're addressing. So to avoid that from happening, it's always good to have a list of key communities and groups in the area that you work in that you could always look back at. And, you know, when you're planning projects, you could be, okay, I need to include a representative of Indigenous persons or representative of women or representative of youth. Thanks, Kenya. I see farming communities. I see you mentioned vegan. Katrina, you're absolutely correct. Youth are always an underrepresented group. So to help yourself or your group or your team in those moments when you're trying to pull off an activity in a short timeline, ensure that you don't miss anyone that's absolutely important. You don't forget persons, because we want to be an inclusive space, and it's not really an excuse to forget people. Ensure that if you have a list that you can always go back to, it helps to avoid situations like that. So if you could think about a list and kind of have that at hand, it's always helpful. And right, thanks, Amira. LGBTQ plus communities, immigrant communities as well, another community that tends to be forgotten a lot. And also when we're organizing, think about how we can include technology and make sure it's accessible to everyone. So I know we've moved to the virtual space due to the pandemic. And technology, it's always easy. It always feels easier. There are pros and cons to technology. Like we've been able to have this meeting where we're connecting to persons across different countries. We're able to reach more persons sometimes. But again, how do we use technology to ensure that it really is accessible to everyone that we would like to include? So feel free to share any thoughts on how you think we can use technology to ensure accessibility. Any thoughts in the chat? Would anyone like to open their mic? I don't want to be telling you everything. Let's have a conversation. Christine, I see your hand is raised.
Yes. So this is something that I think about a lot, technology and access, overall access, because, for example, I am based in Guyana and I'm able to attend many events. And, when I have events for my organization, I'm able to reach a group of persons nationwide. But then I'm still not able to reach people right in my neighborhood because they don't have access to safe electricity, or people in my country, like they live in the interior parts of Guyana, so they may not have access to technology, or electricity to start off with. So I think definitely a pro to using technology, but we are not there as yet where I say that, it's still something that is accessible for everybody. I think to make it accessible, you have to go back and, like, I think you have to, like, do a bit of, what you would say, think a little bit farther into it, because they don't have electricity, so they wouldn't have technology, they wouldn't have access. So I think with the global pandemic, we have seen that divide between people that have and people who do not have. So, for example, technology did make it easier for us to reach a larger group, but I still see there is, for example, in education, there's still a divide among our students, just because they don't have access at all.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for that, Christine. It is a weight and scale of how do you use it for all the good, but then how do you reach the people that do not have access to it? And I see Kanita mentioned in the chat use of media to share with all persons, ensuring that differently able people may be able to participate by using sign language, also use of hybrid methods to allow for persons with no access to technology to attend. Definitely bridging that gap between persons who have access to technology and can join from a virtual space and persons who do not have access, and still creating a space on the ground in person for those persons. So thank you for that as well, Kanita. So just actually, I live in Guyana. So in our case, I'm very familiar with like the issues with trying to reach Indigenous communities and them not having access or technology. So in our case, or in cases where there are Indigenous, poor, or remote communities, sometimes you may need to supply credits, phone credit for them to activate a data plan to join in, or in those cases, you may need to have meetings in their communities to be able to allow them to participate. And I see Kenita, Kenya, sorry, mentioned making technology easier for people to use and also basic training in preferred technology that would be used. Definitely, when you're organizing in the digital space using platforms that are easy to access, like Zoom, platforms that persons are already familiar with, and there isn't like complex training that they need to do to use it is important so that they could easily join in. And just adding to what Kanita had also mentioned about ensuring persons, differently able persons are able to participate. She mentioned using sign language, or you could also add subtitles on videos to ensure for deaf persons as well. In the case of social media and with images, there's the option to add alt text, which is basically a description of what the photograph or the image is showing. So then visually impaired persons are able to get a description of that image using screen readers so they know what is being shown on the screen. And I see Christine mentioned again, not only technology, but using other forms of media like radio and newspaper to bridge the gap. Definitely. So when we say technology, a lot of times we think internet and computers, but there is still technology that we had from before, like radios, television, newspapers, using all of that to reach people where they are. I see, Rick, you have your hand up.
Yes. I just want to mention when it comes to indigenous communities, like here in Belize, there's a section in the southern part of our country. There's no electricity. Sometimes there's not even running water now. Then again, when you have meetings with parents, let me put it that way, you see all the females coming for the meeting. There's no male. Why? The male are out farming. When the male come, then you believe that the correct information will be passed on from the female to the male. The female cannot make any decision then. So you'll have to wait another while before you get the information you need. And if you want to get through to the males, you would have to wait until the Sunday, which is the male's day of rest. And then at that meeting, you are not going to have any female, but you're going to see only male. So it becomes interesting because when you want a decision, it cannot be done. You have to wait a little longer. And when you want a decision, like it is really urgent, you have to wait on the different day. And then even when you wait on the different day, then it becomes, how to say it, there starts to become a lot of discussion. So instead of planning a 1 hour meeting, you end up having a 2-3 hour meeting because everybody has their ideas, and then due to the differences in opinion, everybody believes they are right and their ideas should be taken into consideration. And coming back to technology, I look at the interpretation or the interpreter as technology, especially in those indigenous communities, because I cannot speak Maya. I don't know the Maya language. I need to get an interpreter to be there and do that interpretation for me. So I have to speak English, then they translate, then I have to wait, then we do the back and forth because it's a stop and go type of translation. And even when getting information, that I have to wait for them to interpret what they're saying so that I can get the information, and again the back and forth. So it takes a while, no? But definitely having that translator, even with the language, is for me also a part of technology, so that, like you said, it's accessible for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. And on your first point, it also ties into what Christine mentioned about understanding the cultural dynamics of those different communities. So in that case, like how you have an understanding of which days work for the women, which days work for the men, how decision making happens in that community, what time you would be able to get the men, or what time you would be able to get the women, what time you would not be able to get them is important to consider when you're planning activities and events, because you need to find a good spot that works, that allows you to interact with those persons and to hear from them and to have them contribute to the decisions that you would like to make or the activity that you would like to host. So it's important in inclusive organizing to not say that, oh, you can't get the men on this day, or you can't get the women on this day, or they take too long to make decisions and it's too complex, and then you exclude them because you say, okay, it's difficult working with them. That's not how it works. You definitely need to understand those dynamics and then try to facilitate and work with those dynamics to include them in the activities that you have. So I'm really glad that you shared that, Rick. It really helps to put the community context and the different dynamics into context. Um, and with your mention on Indigenous languages, it actually ties into our next question, which is how can we include communities of different languages? So in this case, as you mentioned, it's important to have the translation for Indigenous communities as well. So not just in spaces like these where we're like using English, Spanish, and what might be considered more universally recognized languages, it's important to give value and inclusion to Indigenous languages and facilitate that translation in cases where you're not able to speak an Indigenous language, or they're not able to understand the language that you speak. So just on this question as well, Any other thoughts on how we can include communities of different languages? Our space that we have here with the bilanguage setup with the English and Spanish, we have our interpreters available here. That's a good example of if you're having a virtual space, you try to have interpreters whenever possible. And also just an example with the slideshow, whatever materials you're using in bilingual, or multilingual spaces, that the materials that you're sharing, they're translated as well. And in terms of videos, you could also videos and images, ensure that those are translated as well. Thanks, Kenya. Translations, captions, subtitles. Yes, definitely. So if you have a video, you could either translate the audio, or if you're not able to translate the audio, you have subtitles that are of the different language that of your community that you're hoping to reach. If you're posting on social media, ensure that your captions are also translated into different languages of your community. And when it comes to translations, give priority to it. Just don't treat translations as something that you're going to do tomorrow. If you share something in English today and you know your community is bilingual or multilingual, try to share those translated materials at the same time. Also, when it comes to languages, it's important to note that not because someone speaks a different language, that means they're uneducated. I know there are a lot of cases where persons are not able to speak English clearly. It's their second language. They might be in a space where there are no translators available and they have to speak English as their second language, but they might not be very good at speaking English as yet. And sometimes because they're speaking slowly, persons tend to feel like they're uneducated or they don't listen to what they have to share. It's important for us to remember that not because someone speaks a different language means that it's a judgment on their level of education. Need to give value to their inputs and give them space to share if they're attempting to speak English as a second language. So thank you so much for sharing in the chat and for opening your mic and contributing to that little conversation, because part of inclusive organizing is to ensure that when you hold spaces, you're not just speaking to people, but ensure that it's a conversation, that there's back and forth happening. You're sharing thoughts, you're sharing perspectives, you're sharing in decision making. So I'm really happy that we got some inputs from you all on that. So just to close off, to touch briefly on what can we do to ensure that we organize inclusively. We can become educated, so we can learn more about inclusive organizing and how best to ensure we involve persons from different communities. We can be intentional, make inclusion a conscious effort and priority. So don't treat inclusion as an additional task that you don't have time for. It should be a core part of your work. You don't want to end up excluding persons or having persons in a diverse group, but then isolating persons within that group. We can also help persons to get involved. So persons who are commonly marginalized have a lot of experiences of being in spaces, but not being fully included. So they may not always feel welcome to speak up. So not because you have someone from a different community in a space, you just kind of leave it on them to speak up. And if they don't speak, you just leave it as that and say, you tried. You should always try to reach out directly to them and encourage them to be involved, share opportunities, provide support, let them know that they're welcomed so that they could share and participate in the space. And we can also ensure that we center voices of marginalized communities. So ensure that when persons speak up, their voices are heard and not dismissed. We can do our part to ensure we give space to persons who are usually marginalized to share their perspectives. And what we should not do is assume that marginalized communities don't understand climate change or they don't care. We should not devalue someone's knowledge because they come from a marginalized community. Thank you, Rick, for participating. I'm sorry to see you leave so soon, but hopefully see you at the next training. So, right. So persons, we should not assume that marginalized communities don't understand climate change or they don't care, because persons have a wealth of knowledge and lived experiences, which are equally important in the fight against climate crisis. Persons from marginalized communities experience some of the worst impacts, and we should not assume that they do not care or they do not have solutions to offer. We should also not try to get persons on board with our solutions before understanding their priorities. When we reach out to involve a group in our work, we should not say that this is what we want from you, but rather we should learn about the group and what their priorities are and what they want to do, and then see how we can support each other. Don't try to prescribe a solution for the group because they are the ones who are facing the issues on the ground, and they have good knowledge on what solutions may or may not work. So it should always be a partnership, a conversation where you equally come together and decide on how you want to move forward, what solutions might be best, what decisions should be made. Also, we should not assume that if you open doors, people will come. We should be proactive and reach out to various groups, directly invite persons to your activities, because many times persons they have experiences where they show up to space and they're not welcome. So they tend to not show up to spaces sometimes. So reach out directly to persons, let them know they're welcome, invite them to participate. And we should also not assume that it's other people's responsibility to organize inclusively. It's everyone's responsibility collectively to be inclusive of others. If we just assume it's someone else's responsibility, it will never be done. So we should all actively try to organize inclusively and welcome people into our spaces. And just to close off, here are some additional resources on inclusive organizing that we can review. I see Amira just dropped the link for the presentation in the chat, and we'll also share it as well after the training, so you can have access to the information and to the links to check them out. So this brings us to the end of the session. I'm going to pause now, and if you have any questions, you can open your mic or you can type in the chat and let me know. Are there any questions? If there are no questions, I actually do have one. So I would like to know, what is one thing you've learned from this session? Maybe what's one thing about inclusive organizing that you'll take away and perhaps practice in your work from this session? Feel free to drop it in the chat or open your mic. Christine, go ahead.
Thank you, FIFA. Thank you so much for the conversation, everybody. I think more so a reminder than learn. I think it's always good to keep learning these concepts, even as people who, they already practice these principles in being inclusive of communities that they serve. I think it's always good to be reminded of it and to practice it continuously. Something that Rick mentioned before he left that I'm reflecting on is how he said the interpreters are actually a means of technology in a sense, because you really depend on them. So for me, I think it's just a really good reminder for me to keep keep doing, inclusive work because it's really necessary, and keep being in spaces and sharing my own voices. And I think just having conversation on these topics is really necessary.
Definitely. Thank you, Christine. It's always a reminder for persons in this space. Learning never stops. So there's always space to learn new ways to involve persons. And then when you have new technology, for example, we moved to Zoom and virtual space, we had to relearn how to make this virtual space inclusive. So there's always going to be some new method that we use that we're going to need to analyze and see how best we can make it inclusive for the people that we want to involve. Katrina, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead. Sorry, Katrina, I'm not hearing you.
Katrina, you're on mute.
Not sure what's happening because I actually see your mic open, Katrina, but I'm not hearing anything. Feel free to type it in the chat. Sure. I see Katrina's having some trouble, but Katrina, feel free to share your thoughts in the chat as well. Would anyone like to say what's... Okay, Katrina says, it's great to plan ahead in terms of being inclusive. Definitely. Definitely plan ahead. Don't leave it as something that you look at last, else you will end up excluding persons. So have your list when, if you have time before you're actually getting into planning an event, that's when you think about how who you need to involve, how you can best involve people from different backgrounds and communities in your activities, kind of have that plan or some steps outlined in advance. So when you're in the middle of planning, if you have a short timeline, nothing gets left out. Always good to plan ahead. Thanks, Katrina. Definitely, Kenya. Inclusive organizing helps with creativity and productivity with projects and programs. More people, different backgrounds, different ideas, amazing things. That's the formula. Okay, so if no one else would like to share, I would just like to thank you all for joining in with us today. Thank you all for participating in the discussion. You can look out for next trainings on the first and second Wednesday of June. The details will be shared on our social media pages at Caribbean Climate Network in the coming weeks. And we also have a roundtable discussion happening on May 25th. So you can check our pages as well for a link to sign up and join that discussion as well. So really happy to have you all in the space and participating, and we look forward to seeing you again.